The hour of 2 p.m. having actually passed, I'm going to call the Conference Committee on House File 2073, the Higher Education Budget Bill, to order. The first thing we're going to do is have staff walk through the spreadsheet by House and Senate nonpartisan staff. I think Mr. Savory is going to do that.
Mr. Chair and members, for the record, Ken Savory, House Fiscal Staff, will be walking through the detailed spreadsheet and member packets. My colleague and I, Mr. Olofsson, will trade back and forth between the various change items that the House and Senate have brought to the conference committee. Just for clarification, the detailed spreadsheet has a label in the upper corner titled Higher Education Finance, Conference Committee, HF 2073, side by side. The upper right-hand corner has a timestamp of 3:13 p.m. on the 27th of April. We'll flip to the various change item sections, starting with the Office of Higher Education. That would be page 2. And beginning on line 75, I'll be speaking from the House columns, which are columns N, O, P, and Q, and the Senate columns are J, K, L, and M. So we'll start on line 75, which is change items related to the state grant for the LME increase or living and miscellaneous expense, totaling $21,108,000 in FY 24-25 and $18,202,000 in FY 26-27. The next change item is line 76, which is also for the state grant, which is the federal conformity change item carried by the governor, and identically by House and Senate is $17,729,000 in FY 24-25, and then $10,058,000 in the tails. Line 77 is the maintain current service levels. The operating increase for the Office of Higher Education carried at $4,214,000, and then $3,184,000 in the tails. Line 78 is the SLEDS, or statewide longitudinal education data system, at $1,536,000 in 24-25, and the identical amount in 26-27. Line 79 is no change, and then going to line 80 is the Student Parent Support Initiative, which is $8,425,000 in the first biennium, and then $7 million into the tails. Line 81 is the Director of Tribal Relations, Public Engagement. This position is funded at $277,000 biennially in 24 and 25, and then $286,000 in the tails. Line 82 for the House, the P20 Partnership. Executive Director is blank. Line 83, emergency assistance for post-secondary students or emergency assistance grants, $5,708,000 in 24-25, and then $5,214,000 in 26-27. Line 84 is the Direct Admissions Program. It's an $850,000 increase in 24-25, and the identical increase in the tails. Line 85 is another governor's item, the Transparent Pathway for Child Development Associates, $475,000, one time only occurring in FY 24. Line 86 and the ones that follow are several teacher-related programs. Line 86 is underrepresented teacher candidate program at $3 million in FY 24-25 and $3 million in the tails, the identical amount. Line 87 is the similar program, but for shortage areas, student teachers, $7 million in FY 24-25 and identically in the tails. Line 88 is the teacher shortage loan forgiveness program or repayment program, $6 million in FY 24-25 and then the identical amount in the tails. Line 89 is the next generation nursing assistance training program. The House has language of $3 million in FY 24-25 and then $3 million in the tails as well. Line 90 is the Minnesota American Indian Scholarships, governor's change item, $17 million in 24-25, which the House is carrying, and then the same identical $17 million in the tails. Line 91 is a one-time and single-year increase to the ICAP program at $800,000 in fiscal '24 only. Skipping down a few to line 93 is the next house change item, the MinLink Gateway and Minitex program. That is a $1,350,000 increase in '24-25, and then a slightly larger increase of $1,553,000 in '26-27. Line 94 is the Higher Education Public Service Grants Feasibility Study, a governor's change item carried by the House at $75,000 in FY '24. Line 95 is the dual training competency grants for Office of Higher Ed. The House carries a position of $4,632,000 in FY '24, $632,000 in FY '25, and then similar amounts in the tails of $632,000 going into the tails. Line 96 is the Inclusive Higher Education Program of $1 million in FY '24-25, so $2 million for the '24-25 biennium, and then $2 million in the tails as well. Line 97 is the Tribal College Operation Grants, Supplemental Assistance. This would be $6 million in FY '24-25, and then $6 million in the tails. And so that concludes that page. We're going to flip the page over to find the rest of the house change items, which begin on page number 3, on line 100, on line 108 with the paramedic scholarships. This is the house item of $3.2 million occurring only in FY '24. And then line 109, Fostering Independence Higher Ed Grants. This is an increase to the program of $1.1 million in FY '24-25, and then $1.3 million in FY '26-27. Line 110 is a house item for the Addiction Medicine Fellowship Program. It's $270,000 occurring in FY '24 and into the tails. Line 111 is the Allied Health Technicians appropriation of $5,380,000, only occurring in FY '24, so that is one time. Line 112 is the Foster Care Grant Wraparound Services. This grant is $500,000 in the first year, $500,000 in the second year, and it does not occur in the tails, making it one time. Line 113 is the UI reimbursement appropriation, $990,000 in FY '24-25, and the identical amount in '26 and '27. So Chair and members, line 116, total change items that the House is proposing for the Office of Higher Ed can be seen on line 116. So it's $124,021,000 above base in '24-25, and then differing in the tails, the amount being $95,977,000. And then, Mr. Chair, with your permission, I'll turn it over to Mr. Olafson to cover the Senate proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Eric Olafson, fiscal analyst for the Senate Higher Education Committee. So again, I will be starting on line 75 on page 2 of the spreadsheet. The Senate columns are columns J through M, and I will take a similar cadence and strategy as Mr. Savory did. So starting on line 75, for the state grant LME increase, the Senate appropriates $27,960,000 in the first biennium and $20 million in the tails. On line 76, for the state grant simplification and federal conformity, the Senate appropriates $17,729,000 in the 24-25 biennium and $10,058,000 in the tails. On line 77, to maintain current service levels for agency administration, the Senate appropriates $4,214,000 in 24-25 and $3,184,000 in the tails. On line 78, for the statewide longitudinal education data system, or SLEDS, the Senate appropriates $1,536,000 in the 24-25 biennium and an identical amount in the tails. This matches the House position. Moving on down to the Student Parent Support Initiative on line 80. The Senate appropriates $12,850,000 in the 24-25 biennium and $676,000 in the tails. For the on line 81 for the Director of Tribal Relations for the public engagement and equal opportunities, it's $277,000 in the 24-25 biennium and $286,000 in the tails. Moving on down to line 83 for emergency assistance for post-secondary students, the Senate appropriates $14,462,000 above base for the 24-25 biennium and identical amount in the tails. On line 84 for direct admissions Minnesota, it's at $850,000 in the 24-25 biennium and $850,000 above base in the tails. On line 85 for the transparent pathway for the Child Development Associate, it's $475,000 of one-time money in fiscal year 2024. Moving on down to line 88 for the teacher shortage loan forgiveness program repayment, it's $1,750,000 of additional spending in the 24-25 biennium. On line 90 for the Minnesota American Indian scholarships, we match the House and Governor position of additional $17 million in the 24-25 biennium, and the Senate appropriates additional $17 million in the tails. On line 91 for the Intervention for College Attendance Program Grants, or ICAP, it's additional spending of $800,000 one-time funding in fiscal year 24. On line 92, for the Loan Repayment Assistance Program for Attorneys, or LRAP, it's additional funding of $30,000 per fiscal year, so $60,000 in the 24-25 biennium, and $60,000 of additional spending in the 26-27 biennium. Moving on down to line 94 for the Higher Education Public Service Grants Feasibility Studies. Again, this was a governor's item. It's $75,000 of one-time spending in fiscal year 24. On line 95 for dual training competency grants with OHE, it's $4,264,000 in the 24-25 biennium, and then $264,000 in the tails. On line 96 for inclusive higher education, it's $2 million in the 24-25 biennium and $2 million in the 26-27 biennium. On line 97 for tribal college operations grants or for supplemental assistance grants, it's $6 million in the 24-25 biennium and $6 million of additional funding in the tails. On line 98, for the Minnesota Commitment to Higher Education Act, this is a transfer into a special revenue account. It's $176,903,000 in the 24-25 biennium, and then $49,104,000 per fiscal year ongoing as a transfer, so a total of $98,208,000 in the tails. For the administration and promotion of the Minnesota Commitment to Higher Education Act, it's $600. This is on line 99. It's $698,000 in the 24-25 biennium, and $404,000 in the tails. On line 100 for hunger-free campus grants, it's $1,797,000 in the 24-25 biennium, and $1,877,000 in the 26-27 biennium. On line 101 for the hunger-free equipment grants, it's $500,000 of one-time funding in fiscal year 2024. Moving on to page 3 of the spreadsheet, for line 102, for the summer academic enrichment program, it's $1 million of additional spending in additional one-time spending in fiscal year 24-25 biennium. On line 103 for the Students Basic Needs Working Group, it's $44,000 of one-time spending in fiscal year 2024. On line 104 for the Minnesota Association of Black Lawyers Pipeline, it's one-time funding of $700,000 for the 24-25 biennium. On line 105, for the Minnesota Independence College and Community, it's additional spending to the base of $2 million in the 24-25 biennium, but then that additional funding is made available until fiscal year 27, but then it's a base discontinuation in the tails of $2 million of removing the Minnesota Independence College and Community from the base. And then on line 106 for College Possible, it makes the base funding one time, so it removes 1.1 million of tail spending for College Possible. On line 107 for a report on Minnesota's Min-State course placement practices, it's $250,000 of one-time spending in fiscal year 2024. Moving on down to line 109 for additional funding to Fostering Independence Higher Education Grants. It's $1,141,000 in the 24-25 biennium and $1,310,000 in the 26-27 biennium. And then moving on down to line 112 for the foster care grants for wraparound services, we match the House position. The Senate matches the House position of $1 million of one-time funding in the 24-25 biennium. So for a total total additional spending to the Office of Higher Education, this is on line 116, for the 24-25 biennium is $298,335,000. And then the tails, it's an additional spending of $175,075,000. And with that, I'll hand it back to Mr. Savory.
Chair and members will move now to the system, starting with Minnesota State. So we'll turn the page to page number 4 and start with the change items for Minnesota State on line 155, being the header. And then the first one is on line 156, which is the Minnesota State Stabilization Appropriation. The House is proposing $122 million for that purpose in 24-25, and then an amount of $93,800,000 in FY 26-27. Line 157 is an appropriation of campus one-time support only occurring in fiscal 24 of $50 million. Line 158, the House is proposing ISRS, the Next Generation and System-Wide Technology Appropriation of $3 million in FY 24-25, and then $2,200,000 in 26-27. Line 159, the House provides an appropriation for a tuition freeze at Minnesota State and provides language specifying it of $75 million in FY 24-25, and then $100 million in FY 26-27. Line 160 is the Workforce Development Scholarships. This would be an increase above base one time of $12,500,000. Line 161 is an appropriation for student support of $26 million in FY 24-25, and then $4 million in FY 26-27. Line 162 is an appropriation for individual retirement account payment contribution increases, and that would be $1,733,000 in 24-25, and then a slightly different amount of $1,777,000 in the tails. And then line 164 is the equipment and learning environments appropriation, would be $25 million only occurring one time in FY 24-25. Line 165, the develop and expand industry sector programming appropriation of $12,500,000, again only occurring one time. And then line 166 is an appropriation for the open education resources, or is referred to in the rider language as the Z degree textbook program of $2 million. That is one time. And then line 167, an appropriation for UI reimbursement of $1,618,000, and then an identical amount in the tails. Line 173 is the total for operations and maintenance above base. You look in the column O and column Q, you'll see $331,351,000 in 24-25, and then $203,395,000 in FY 26-27. And Mr. Chair, I'd turn it back to Mr. Olafson to cover the mid-state portion for the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Savory. So still on page 4 of the spreadsheet, and again, we'll move back to columns J through M for the Senate position. So starting on line 156 for the Minnesota State Stabilization, the Senate for fiscal year 24-25, it appropriates $119 million, and then in the tails, $162 million. On line 157 for campus one-time support, the Senate appropriates $74 million in fiscal year 24, and that's one-time spending. On line 158 for the ISRS, or Next Generation System-Wide Technology, to support technology throughout the Min-State system, it's $3 million in the 24-25 biennium and $4 million in the 26-27 biennium. Moving on down to line 161 for student support, it's $26 million in the 24-25 biennium and $10 million in the 26-27 biennium. For the individual retirement account plan contribution increase, the Senate appropriates $521,000 in the 24-25 biennium and $1,245,000 in the tails. Moving on down to line 168 to provide menstrual products at the Min-State campuses, the Senate appropriates $764,000 in the 24-25 biennium and $564,000 in the tails. On line 169, for the P20 Partnership Executive Director position, this was originally a governor's recommendation within the Office of Higher Education. There is a carve-out within the operations and management portion of the Min-State budget of $277,000 in the 24-25 biennium and $286,000 in the tails. So looking just on line 171, focusing on columns K and M for a total operations and O&M change of $223,285,000 in the 24-25 biennium and $177,809,000 in the tails. I'd also like to move on down to other programs and appropriations as the Senate appropriates for workforce development in other programs and appropriations rather than within O&M. So looking at line 182 for workforce development equipment upgrades, the Senate appropriates $20 million in the 24-25 biennium, and that's one-time additional spending. And then on line 183 for industry sector programming for workforce development, it's $10 million in the 24-25 biennium. So for a total additional spending within other programs and appropriations of $30 million for the 24-25 biennium and nothing in the tails. So looking at the total change of appropriations from the general fund to Min-State, this is on line 189, looking at columns K and M. It's $256,285,000 in the 24-25 biennium and $181,809,000 in the tails. And with that, I'll hand it back to Mr. Savory to talk about the University of Minnesota.
Mr. Savory.
Chair and members, we'll turn next to the University of Minnesota. That begins on page number 5, and the change items start on line 206 is the header and 207 is the first change. The House is proposing $135 million in core mission support, an increase to the O&M appropriation, and $145 million in the tails, 26-27. Line 208, the House is proposing $48 million to an appropriation for enrollment tuition shortfall, and that is a one-time appropriation occurring once. And line 209, House is proposing system-wide safety and security. This item is broken into two pieces, $10 million in FY 24-25 with an additional $4 million in the tails of 26 and 27. And then the House is proposing on the line below that, line 210, an additional carve-out of $6 million in FY 26-27, making it, with the two being added together to be an identical $10 million to the line 209 in the tails. Line 211 is the UI reimbursement appropriation of $732,000 in 24-25, and then an identical amount in 26 and 27. And then, Mr. Chair, I turn it back to Mr. Olson for the Senate U of M change items.
Mr. Olofson.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, so still on page 5 and looking at line 207 for the Senate position. For core mission support, the Senate appropriates $70 million in the 24-25 biennium and $90 million in the tails. Moving on down to line 212, this is to provide menstrual products at the University of Minnesota Systems campuses. It's $484,000 in the 24-25 biennium and $220,000 in the tails. So for a total O&M change of $70,484,000 in the 24-25 biennium and $90,220,000 in the tails. I will also mention, moving on down to line 227, for change items outside of O&M. So for NRRI, the Senate appropriates an additional $4 million in the 24-25 biennium and $2 million in the 26-27 biennium. And then for U of M, the Centricare Health, for University of Minnesota and Centricare, this is on line 228, the Senate proposes an additional, proposes an appropriation of $20 million in the one-time spending in fiscal year 2024. So moving on down to line 239, just focusing on columns K and M for a total general fund additional spending for the University of Minnesota of $94,484,000 in the 24-25 biennium, and then $92,220,000 in the tails. And with that, I'll hand it back to Mr. Savory.
Mr. Savory.
Chair and members, just one concluding thought. For the House change above base on line 239 for the U of M is $193,732,000, and then the tails of $149,732,000. We will flip the page to line 6 to cover the final agency within the committee's jurisdiction, which is the Mayo Foundation. The House is proposing a change item on line 248, which is $896,000 above the base for the Mayo Family Medicine and Residency Program. And the $896,000 is also carried in the 26-27 tails appropriation. And the $896,000 is the only change item for Mayo, and that is the change from base. And I will turn back to Mr. Olofsson for the Senate Mayo change items.
Mr. Olofsson.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, the Senate has an identical provision for the Mayo Family Medicine and Residency Program. This is again on line 248 of $896,000 in the 24-25 biennium and $896,000 in the 26-27 biennium. And then just for the committee's information, we were given a target of $650 million for the 24-25 biennium and $450 million in the 26-27 biennium. And then on line 260, columns K and M, you can see that the Senate position matches that, and then the House position also matches it on columns O and Q. And then lines 266 through 286 is just for the clarification information for the committee, just showing the different transfers that are occurring throughout the appropriations that Mr. Savory and I have already described throughout our walkthrough.
All right. So we'll move to the next item on the agenda, the walkthrough of the side-by-sides. And I think Mr. Hopkins.
Mr. Chair and members, Nathan Hopkins from House Research. Ms. White from Senate Council and I will be passing the responsibility of walking through these documents back and forth. I'll let you know when we pass it over. But I'm going to be walking through a document that's in members' packets with a heading of List of Language Differences. This is a summary of the language differences between the House and the Senate bill. This summary document references the reviser's side-by-side document, and members might find it helpful to look through the reviser's side-by-side document as I walk through the summary. I'll be referencing the R pages, which are at the bottom of the reviser's side-by-side in the center. Beginning with Article 1, and as I walk through language differences in Article 1, these are really just meant to capture differences in the rider language, not differences in the spending or in the actual appropriations between the two bodies, so just really language differences. On R2 to R3, the tribal college grants. The House and the Senate use slightly different names for this appropriation. That's really a technical difference. The Senate, however, on R3 also includes a requirement that tribal operational funding supplement and not supplant existing funding. Turning to R5, this is within the college possible appropriation. The Senate includes a requirement that funds be allocated proportionately between Greater Minnesota and the metro area. That requirement has been included in prior omnibus acts. On R7 to R8 of the side-by-side, this is the appropriation for the emergency assistance for post-secondary student grants. The rider language in the House side is unchanged from previous omnibus acts. The Senate language, however, does not include the matching basis provision that is in the House language. The Senate language also requires institutions to return unused funds to OHE at the end of the biennium. In addition, the Senate specifies that specific amounts appropriated to the Minnesota State System, the University of Minnesota, and Minnesota tribal colleges. And finally, the Senate language specifies that the commissioner must not distribute funds under this section until the methods for distributing the grants and reporting requirements are approved. On R10 to R11 of the side-by-side, this is within the appropriation for hunger-free campus grants. The riders in the House language are unchanged from previous omnibus acts. The Senate, however, includes a one-time appropriation in fiscal year 2024 for higher education institutions to provide equipment necessary to operate an on-campus food pantry. The commissioner shall establish an application process for distributing the grant funds. On R13, the side-by-side, this is within the Inclusive Higher Education Technical Assistance Center appropriation. The House allows the Office of Higher Education to use 3% of the total appropriation for its administrative costs. That comes down to about $30,000 per year for administrative costs. And the Senate allows the Office of Higher Education to use 5% of the amount that's transferred in paragraph B on Senate line 14.30 for administrative costs, and that factors out to about $37,500 per year for administrative costs. On R15, the foster care grants. The House makes this an application-based competitive grant, while the Senate designates a specific grant recipient. The Senate also includes this grant within its larger appropriation for the Fostering Independence Higher Education Grant Program, while the House makes it a separate line item appropriation. On R19 to R20, this is within the appropriations for Minnesota State colleges and universities within the operations and maintenance appropriation. The House, at the bottom of R19, going on to R20, the House imposes a tuition freeze for degree granting undergraduate programs in the 23 to 24 and 24 to 25 academic years, and that is a House-only provision. And Mr. Chair, Ms. White will continue with the remainder of Article 1 and move on to Article 2.
Ms. White.
Mr. Chair and members, on R21 and R22 relates to Minnesota State Open Educational Resources. The House expands this rider to include free course materials beyond the statutory Z degree program, and this is related to the House's increase in the funding for this rider. And the rider in the Senate is unchanged from the previous Omnibus Act. The next is on R22, Minnesota State Student Support Services. The Senate rider requires system-wide resources to be available 24/7 online and via telephone and text, and the House only requires the resources to be available 24/7 online. On R22, Minnesota State upgrades to equipment and learning environments. The Senate makes this rider under a separate workforce development appropriation, while the House includes it as a rider within the larger O&M appropriation. And the Senate rider also provides greater detail about possible uses of funds. R22 and 23, Minnesota State Industry Sector Programming. The Senate makes this rider under a separate workforce development appropriation again, while the House indicates it is as a rider within the larger O&M appropriation. On R31 and 33, this relates to financial review of grant recipients. Both chambers include new sections requiring state agencies to review the finances of grant and award recipients and authorizes agencies to delay or deny grants under certain circumstances. However, there are significant differences between the two sections. And
Mr.
on to,
Oops, sorry, go ahead.
on to Article 2, the policy provisions. This starts on R34, Senate-only provision related to access to menstrual products. The Senate requires Min-State and requests the U of M to provide students with access to menstrual products at no charge. R34 is a Senate-only provision related to hunger-free campus designation approval. The Senate amends the hunger-free campus program by requiring the Student Advisory Council, instead of different student associations, to create an application process and make recommendations to the commissioner. And the commissioner shall have final approval for the designation and the award amount. Also on R34, Hunger-Free Campus Competitive Grant. The Senate expands the grants to nonprofit private post-secondary institutions and also increases the initial institution designation award and the sustaining award. No more than 20% of the total grant awards shall be for grants to nonprofit private post-secondary institutions. On R38, the inclusive higher education grants. The House and Senate language is identical with the exception that the Senate makes public and private nonprofit post-secondary institutions eligible. The House only makes public post-secondary institutions eligible for the grants. R41 and 42 amends the Student Advisory Council to include the duty mentioned previously related to the hunger-free campus applicants. R43, State Grant Program Reporting. The Senate requires OHE to provide spending projections for the Minnesota Commitment to Higher Education Act. Current law requires spending projections for only the state grant program. R48 and 49 is a Senate-only provision, the Minnesota Commitment to Higher Education Act. The Senate establishes the Minnesota Commitment to Higher Education Act, which is the last dollar program paying for the actual tuition and fees at public colleges and universities and tribal colleges for students with an adjusted gross household income below $80,000. R51, House and Senate are different, Teacher Shortage Loan Repayment Program. Both sections prioritize awards to applicants for underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, and the differences in the section are merely technical. R51 is House-only provision, dual training competency grants. The House adds to the cost of training recommended books and materials in addition to required books and materials. R53, both House and Senate have this program, but they're different. The House limits the automatic conditional admission under this program to public post-secondary institutions. The Senate also includes private post-secondary institutions. And the Senate also requires OHE to provide students with information about the state grant program, the Minnesota Commitment to Higher Education Act, and encourage students to determine financial eligibility. The next is the Minnesota Board of Trustees responsibility, a House-only provision on R53. The House makes a technical change to eliminate a reference to the Trustee Candidate Advisory Council, which the bill repeals on R59.
That does it. We're going back, Mr. Hopkins.
Mr. Chair and members, beginning on R54 of the side-by-side, these next few sections affect the Workforce Development Scholarship Program administered by Minnesota State. R54, there's a House-only provision, program eligibility. This expands the scholarship program to include students enrolled in their first and second years at state universities who may receive awards of $3,500. It also expands the scholarship program to include students enrolled in certificate programs who may receive awards of $1,500. Also on R54, House-only provision related to workforce development scholarships, renewal cap. The House increases the total lifetime award cap on scholarships from $7,500 per student to $12,000 per student. Also on R54, House-only provision, workforce development scholarships administration. The House allows up to 1.5% of program funds to be used for administering the program. Turning to R55, post-secondary unemployment insurance aid. This is a House-only provision. The House provides state aid to support unemployment insurance payments by the University of Minnesota, Minnesota State, and the tribal colleges. The aid must be appropriated by the state legislature, but this section sets target amounts at the difference between each entity's unemployment insurance costs in 2022 and those costs for the current year. This is intended to compensate for the expanded eligibility of certain higher education employees for unemployment benefits between school terms, and the provision for that is being carried in the Education Finance Bill. R55 to R56, the employer contribution rate. So both the House and the Senate sections increase employer contribution rates for the Individual Retirement Account Plan, or IRAP, to 8.75%, so that it equals the employer contribution rate for the Teachers Retirement Association, or TRA plan. The difference here is that the House increases the rate to 8.75% immediately, while the Senate increases it to that amount gradually. R56 to R57. There is a House-only provision establishing a new paramedic scholarship program. This is a temporary scholarship program for students enrolled in paramedic programs. R57 to R58, another House-only provision, the Allied Health Technician Scholarship Program. This is another new temporary scholarship program, and this one is for students newly entering specified health technician programs. On R58, towards the bottom of R58, unemployment insurance aid reports. This is a House-only provision. This requires annual reports to the legislature on unemployment insurance aid under the new section that I previously discussed on R55. At the very bottom of R58, going on to R59, another House-only provision, higher education bonding policy. The House includes an uncodified section declaring the intent of the legislature not to require public post-secondary systems to pay for portions of their bonding projects. On R59, the House-only provision, this is a repealer. This is repealing the Min-State Trustee Candidate Advisory Council, which is tasked with making non-binding recommendations to the governor for appointments to the Min-State Board of Trustees. That board has not been active since 2012. The second part of the repealer, the House also repeals a subdivision in the Workforce Development Scholarship Statute that sets award amounts. Those award amounts are now controlled under the new House language on R54. The last two sections, these are both Senate-only provisions. On R59, the Post-Secondary Student Basic Needs Working Group and report requirement. The Senate requires the Office of Higher Education to convene a working group on post-secondary student basic needs. They must submit a report that includes a comprehensive plan on how to identify, assess, and support students who are experiencing housing and food insecurity, and that report is due September 1, 2024. Finally, on R60, a Senate-only provision, This is a report requirement on Minnesota State Colleges and Universities course placement practices. The Senate requires the Office of Higher Education to complete a report on MnState's course placement practices. The preliminary report is due February 1, 2024, with a final report containing recommendations and findings due February 1, 2025. Mr. Chair, that concludes the walkthrough of the side-by-side summary.
All right. At this point, I'm going to turn the gavel over to Senator Fateh, and he is going to monitor the public testimony with his own gavel.
Thank you, Chair Pawlowski, and thank you to the staff for the walkthroughs. First up, we have on the testifier list Commissioner Dennis Olson. Welcome. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed.
Good afternoon, Chair Fateh, Chair Pawlowski, members of the Conference Committee. For the record, my name is Dennis Olson. I'm proud to serve as the Commissioner of the Office of Minnesota Office of Higher Education. Thank you for the opportunity to provide a brief testimony today in support of numerous proposals in both the House and Senate bills before you today. Since I'm first on the list here, I won't take too much time as it's critically important for you all to hear from students and faculty and members of the community to share their thoughts on the bill as well. I will mention, though, throughout this legislative session, we've of course heard countless times about the many opportunities we have to make historic investments in higher education. And although the needs of our students and institutions are great, we have the ability this session to make long-lasting and meaningful impact for higher education in Minnesota for generations to come. I'd like to genuinely thank the committees for working to incorporate a significant number of the governor's budget recommendations in both of your bills, and we especially appreciate the recognition that targeted supports, investments, and financial aid modifications that improve programs like the Minnesota State Grant are the exact responses we need at a time when our students and our institutions continue to recover from the impacts of the pandemic. Their needs are greater now more than ever. We appreciate that both bills are seeking to provide additional support for the University of Minnesota and the Minnesota state system to align closely with the governor's recommendations to support operations and maintenance requests of both systems, as well as providing additional student support services. Throughout this session, we heard numerous times from students, faculty, and administrators about the significant needs on campuses, especially related to student basic needs. And the proposed investments in components of both bills address student needs and will help campus leaders and faculty to continue to provide students with a world-class education, all while relying on stable, predictable, and sustainable campus funding. We greatly appreciate your continued support for the Minnesota Office of Higher Education and the critical programs we manage on behalf of Minnesota students. For the Minnesota State Grant, your recommended investment will allow the Minnesota State Grant to continue to help nearly 70,000 low and middle income students attend the college of their choice. Your recommended increase to 115% of the federal poverty guideline to the living and miscellaneous expense is especially beneficial for low income students and families, allowing students to address additional costs of college outside of tuition and fees. And your recommended investments to conform to federal FAFSA changes will position the state to continue to provide strong and sustainable state grants to students. Thank you as well for incorporating additional funding focused on workforce development, especially for dual training grants, and for providing funding necessary to add 2 new critical industry areas for eligibility. This investment provides greater opportunities for students looking for training in an in-demand career and allows greater connections between employees and employers in our state. We also thank you for strong support for new initiatives such as the Minnesota American Indian Scholars Program, the Student Parent Initiative, and continued funding to further build out Direct Admissions Minnesota. We also appreciate that both bills include funding for our tribal colleges in Minnesota. We heard incredible testimony on the need throughout this session, and I'm happy to see that this proposal has strong bipartisan support. We know that there are still items needed to be worked through. We look forward to working with the committee and other stakeholders as the bill continues through the process to create the best possible bill for Minnesota students during this conference committee. Again, our agency thanks you for the great working relationship we have had with you and your staff thus far. And finally, chairs and members, I want to reiterate that we do have an incredible opportunity here. We really do. One we might not see again for many sessions to come. We have an opportunity to develop a strong bill that will serve Minnesota students and our Minnesota institutions in the ways that they have asked for all sessions and in previous sessions before, and in the ways that they all deserve. Chairs Pulowski and Fateh, thank you for the opportunity to address the conference committee today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Olson. We'll pause real quick for questions from our members. Are there any questions for the Commissioner? Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Chair. Just really quickly, you had mentioned the dual training program that you added 2 new categories. Can you just remind me what those 2 were?
Yeah, child care, early childhood, and transportation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair.
All right, we'll be continuing with our list. We will be limiting testimony to 2 minutes each speaker. First up, we have Bill Mackey. Welcome, and introduce yourself for the record, and please proceed with your testimony.
Thank you. Chair Fateh, Chair Pulowski, members of the conference committee, my name is Bill Mackey, and I serve as the Vice Chancellor for Finance and Facilities for Minnesota State. On behalf of Board Chair Roger Moe and Chancellor Malhotra, I want to thank you for your leadership, a strong higher education target, and the priorities set forth in both bills. There are many important provisions in both bills, but as the system's CFO, today I'm going to focus my remarks on our college and university budgets. We testified this session and provided college and university specific data that even if Minnesota State were to receive full funding for operations and maintenance and a fully funded tuition freeze, colleges and universities would still be faced with budget shortfalls. We sincerely appreciate the addition of one-time funds for campus support in both bills to provide additional relief to those that are continuing to struggle with enrollment declines. That is why it is so imperative, at minimum, for Minnesota State's request of $125 million for stabilization to be funded. System-wide, our colleges and universities rely on state appropriation to cover 53% of their general fund operating budgets. We also have testified that about 75% of Minnesota State's general fund budget is comprised of compensation costs. As a reminder, we are responsible for negotiating IFO, MSCF, and MUSAF contracts, but the state negotiates AFSCME, MAPE, MMA, and all the other plans our employees are in. Without this O&M funding, our campuses will be forced to make additional long-term budget reductions, and as you are likely aware, a number of our campuses have and currently are making difficult budget decisions. Along with fully funding our stabilization request, we appreciate that the House bill includes a fully funded tuition freeze. Although the colleges and universities of Minnesota State provide the most affordable, equitable, and accessible higher education options in the state, tuition and the student cost of attendance remain key challenges for our students and significant obstacles to their success. Mr. Chair, thank you for everything you, Chair Pulowski, and the conferees have done for higher education this session. We are grateful for the strong support for Minnesota State, our students, and the communities we serve. And we understand you will all have some difficult decisions to make in the coming days. That concludes my remarks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much for your testimony, Mr. Mackey. Next up, we have Myron Friends. And next on deck, we have Ms. Sacardande. Welcome, please introduce yourself and please proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the conference committee. I want to thank you for asking us here today for the testimony. I want to point out that I'm Myron Franz, the Senior Vice President for the University of Minnesota in charge of finance and operations, and I'm joined today with
Mr. Franz, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Do you mind speaking closer to the mic? Thank you.
People really want to hear this, right? Thank you for being here. I want to introduce two members of our Board of Regents that are here today with me, Regent James Farnsworth and Co-Vice Chair Regent Michael Kenyanya. And I want to thank the legislature for providing us with our new regents just Monday night. Thank you for that opportunity to invest in the leadership at the university. We're at a really pivotal point here for all of us, I think, and I really respect both Mr. Mackey and Commissioner Olson for talking about students first, because that is really why we're here, is how do we collectively as a state continue to support our students in securing their opportunities in front of them. How do we support that in ways that make it more of an opportunity for them to join in this education process? One of the things I know that the committee was challenged with in terms of the targets, were presented some challenges, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss that with you throughout this process. As you know, we came with a Board of Regents approved request that was modified to deal with a enrollment shortfall that we found out during the process, but we appreciate the flexibility and the openness of the committee to deal with that issue and to make really good questions and comments for us. We've listened carefully to what we've heard from the committee and the committee members, and we look forward to working with you going forward. I think one of the things I want to end on with is the fact that we believe at the University of Minnesota that a strong educational system throughout this state is the real foundation for the future of this state and the future of the people who come to all of our institutions for higher education. And we look forward to helping and supporting the conference committee in any way that we can. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much for your testimony, Mr. Friends. Next up on the list, we have Ms. Sacardande, followed by D. Baskin. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed.
Thank you, Chair Fateh, Chair Pulowski, and members of this conference committee. My name is Sia Sacardande. I use pronouns like she, her, and hers, and I'm the state coordinator for the undergraduate student government at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. We have worked hard this session to have student voices included in conversations about the future of our institution, and we appreciate members of this committee for including us. Our advocacy efforts on campus and at the Capitol have always focused on supporting student basic needs, as the cost of attending college has become unaffordable for many students without accessing the resources that this bill is including in funding. According to our campus CERU survey results, 26% of students during the pandemic reported facing food insecurity, but during 2022, the numbers has skyrocketed to 36.9%. Food insecurity is a significant issue on the UMN Twin Cities campus that has gotten worse as we are coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Currently classified as a food desert because of the lack of access to stores that accept SNAP or sell affordable food, we have been working to improve on-campus resources like our food pantries. And funding the appropriation for expanding Hunger-Free Campus would allow for expansion of our food pantries to have better equipment to better serve our students. Affordability of our public higher education systems is a problem not just faced by our students, but all across our state and country. Providing resources like the American Indian Scholarship and the Free College Proposal would help reduce the financial burden felt by students, especially those who come from underserved and underrepresented communities. Working to support student basic needs like food insecurity and menstrual equity, along with addressing affordability through this bill would be the first step toward making our public higher education institutions more equitable again, especially for the majority of our students that are struggling right now. Funding these initiatives would work to support the work of student advocates on all 5 of our campuses and the students that depend on our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony, Ms. Sacardande. Next, we have D. Baskin, followed by Pat Benner. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed.
Yes, good afternoon, Chair Fateh, Chair Pulowski, members of the committee. My name is Dee Baskin. I am the Executive Director of Loan Repayment Assistance Program of Minnesota, also known as LRAP. And I wanted to thank the committee for all of your work and historically for supporting LRAP. I am here specifically to ask the committee to adopt the Senate proposal for $55,000 a year for our organization. We have previously received $25,000 per year, which we're very grateful for, which has helped us support 5 attorneys per year with federal student loans. But our attorneys have been asking and begging us to help them with private student loans. And we haven't been able to do that in the past, and there is a definite need. We have more people coming in who have very high levels of private student loan debt, and we want to be able to keep them, especially in areas of greater Minnesota where it's hard to recruit attorneys and retain attorneys. We want to be able to keep them offering services to low-income people. So I just want to thank the committee again for all of your work and ask for support for our organization at $55,000 per year. And I'm happy to answer any questions at this time. Thank you.
Dee, do you mind returning back for a moment? I apologize. Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was asking if, since it's a Senate-only provision and we didn't hear it in the House, if I could ask a quick question.
Oh, yes, please.
Because we didn't, it was a Senate-only provision, so I was just asking if I could ask a quick question. I'm just wondering if you could let us know how long LRAP has been around, like how many years you've been doing this and how many students you typically serve in a year?
Oh, absolutely, great question. Chair, members of the committee, Representative O'Neill. So LRAP has existed since 1991. I've been the executive director since July of 2020. We serve about 50 attorneys per year who are serving about 10,000 low-income Minnesotans per year.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you. I'm sorry, the volume in here is a little bit difficult. Could you just repeat the last thing? I think you said
yes,
50 attorneys that,
Yes, we are serving 50 attorneys per year, and those attorneys serve about 10,000 low-income clients throughout Minnesota each year.
thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for answering the questions.
Thank you.
Mr. Benner, welcome. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed.
Thank you, Chair Fateh, Chair Pawlowski, and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Pat Benner. I'm a legislative representative with AFSCME Council 5. We represent various workers at the Minnesota State and University of Minnesota systems. I want to thank you both for the historic investments in public higher education that you're making in your omnibus bills, particularly the funding of campus stabilization and core mission support at Minnesota State and the University of Minnesota, respectively. As we know, as we already heard, the budgetary issues that we're facing in public higher education stem from enrollment, and a big aspect of that is affordability, and both of your bills go very far to address that issue. Another aspect of the bill that we support, it's a much smaller piece, but ISRS Next Generation for our members at Minnesota State that work with this system every single day. It is, to quote, a nightmare to work with. So updating this vital tech is very much appreciated. And then lastly, I'd like to just point the committee's attention to, I believe on the side-by-side, R55. Which is unemployment insurance expansion for higher education workers. The House funded that position at, I believe, $3.3 million per biennium at Minnesota State and the University of Minnesota. And I appreciate the very positive conversations I've had with both of the chairs on this issue, and appreciate your support. Thank you so much, and I can answer questions if needed.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Benner. So I'm just wondering, the portion that of the AFSCME employees in the Min-State system, that is negotiated by MMB. So all of AFSCME, all of MAPE is all negotiated by MMB, and Min-State doesn't. Can you tell us, if you happen to know, like how many of your members are actually employed at Min-State?
Mr. Benner.
Not off the top of my head, but I can take a quick look at the numbers of our per caps and get back to you.
Thank you.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then the follow-up question to that would be, as you're negotiating with MMB, is the unemployment something that you've considered or have tried to negotiate with MMB as part of the labor contracts?
Mr. Benner.
So I have not, sorry, Mr. Chair and Representative O'Neill, I have not sat at the bargaining table for those, so I'm not a party to that. I don't believe we have asked for this specific provision in bargaining before, but I don't know for sure.
Representative O'Neill?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a final comment. That would be a good place to start because we always try to honor the bargaining contracts. I used to be the SCR chair, so the Subcommittee on Employee Relations chair, so we reviewed all of the state employee contracts, all 11 or so billion. And we, as a legislature, really try to honor those contracts that are negotiated. So as looking at it through that lens, it would be preferable, I believe, for the legislature as a whole, that those are contained within the bargaining negotiations and within the contract itself. And I know Minn State in particular they've said for many years that it's very difficult for them because they don't negotiate those contracts with AFSCME. As you happen to be AFSCME, but there's others as well. But thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a final comment was all.
Thank you, Representative O'Neill, and thank you for your testimony and answering the questions. Next up, we have Kevin Lindstrom, and after that, we'll have Sarah Lancaster. So welcome. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed.
Chair Fateh, Chair Pulowski, and conferees, my name is Kevin Lindstrom, and I'm the president of the Minnesota State College faculty. On behalf of the 4,000 faculty we represent at the two-year colleges in the Minnesota State system, I sincerely thank you for the work you've done to bring forward two bills which recognize the critical role our institutions play in communities throughout the state. It's refreshing to appear before you to discuss the best amongst the good, as opposed to sitting here trying to fend off something less than adequate or worse yet, damaging. Our work in the two-year public colleges has always been founded in access and opportunity. On a daily basis, we carefully consider the needs of the students and communities we serve. The strength and stability of our offerings is directly related to base funding. To that end, the tails really matter. This is especially important for our smaller institutions typically found in greater Minnesota who face the greatest financial sustainability challenges. Combining strong base funding for operations and maintenance with a legislatively funded tuition freeze for students, as found in Article 1, Section 3, Subdivision 3, Part A of the side-by-side, strikes us as an optimal combination in support of access and opportunity. We are also intrigued by and appreciative of efforts to create a system which provides 2 years of free college in our system. We know the amount of financial stress in the lives of many of our students, and we understand the broad implications of student debt. A proposal for 2 years of free college at a Minnesota State institution based on a Pell Match concept is of particular interest. We have always believed in putting the most aid where there is the most need, and a Pell Match is the perfect way to meet that standard. Whether in this session or in a future one, we look forward to a day where 2 years of debt-free public higher education is a given for Minnesota students. As you do your work, I would make one final request. Please consider the disparities between our institutions when considering how money is distributed via your prescription. All of our institutions need support, but it's a simple fact that some need it more than others. As you reconcile the differences in Article 1, Section 3, Subdivision 3, Part B, please consider as large a floor amount as you believe practical for each institution in the system when distributing one-time money. Again, thank you so much for the work you've done and for the work you will do in support of the students, faculty, and institutions in the Minnesota State system.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Lancaster. Are there any questions, Representative O'Neill?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, this is going to be a pattern, you'll see. I'm wondering if you could explain what your view would be of making it equitable and fair between the different institutions or different two-year colleges I believe you spoke to.
Mr. Lancaster?
Mr. Chair, Representative O'Neill, I believe the reference that I made was to the difference between the two bills in terms of one-time money distribution, one being at 200, the other being at 300,000. We would favor a larger amount to recognize those institutions that are at a financial disadvantage, particularly those smaller institutions in greater Minnesota. So in other words, the higher that floor, the better from our perspective.
Representative O'Neill?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's a budget target, and so in order to do that, it has to take from somewhere else. So are you speaking like you want, for example, less to go to the University of Minnesota system and more to the Minn State system, or is that not exactly what you're saying?
Mr. Lindstrom?
Chair Fateh, Representative O'Neill, that is not what I'm saying. Thank you for clarifying. I'm talking about the existing amount already earmarked for that particular provision in the two bills, the one-time dollar distribution. Not seeking a change in the overall amount, but rather how you decide to distribute or prescribe that to institutions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative. And thank you for your testimony and answering the questions.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Sarah Lancaster. Welcome. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed.
Thank you, Chair Fateh, Chair Plowski, and committee members. Thank you again for all of your hard work and dedication to the success of our students. My name is Sarah Lancaster, and I am a first grade teacher at Onamia Public School District 480. I also have the honor of currently serving as the Minnesota State Teacher of the Year. Receiving this title carries with it the weight of being the first educator of Asian Pacific Islander descent in the 58-year history of the program. And the year before me was Natalia Benjamin as the first Latina, and 2016, Abdul Wright as the first African-American male. While it is an honor to serve as the firsts in our state, it also speaks to the minority of and the burden we carry as BIPOC teachers. We've heard before the shortage of teachers of color in our state, but rarely do we hear the stories of how we got here. As the daughter of an immigrant single mother, and the first person in my immediate family to graduate from college, there are many barriers we encounter to pursue a higher education. In order to recruit, retain, and support teachers of color, we must address what is standing in the way of bringing a more inclusive population of educators to our students. Supporting the proposed House investment in the underrepresented student teacher grants will help BIPOC students through the biggest barrier to the profession, which is unpaid student teaching. I myself can attest that during this time was the only moment in my life where I sought food assistance and worked 7 days a week to pay rent. There were many moments during that time when I questioned whether or not I could even afford to become an educator. In order to support the approximately 2,100 BIPOC candidates in the state, I am asking the committee members to reallocate at least $3 million per fiscal year to support the Aspiring Teachers of Color scholarships. Now working as the only licensed teacher of color in my entire district, I can also speak to the feelings of isolation that many of us experience. In order to recruit and retain the number of BIPOC educators, I am imploring you to shift the House's proposed increased investment of $3 million per fiscal year for the loan repayment program to the Aspiring Teacher of Colors Scholarship. This will ensure that education is a career path that welcomes BIPOC students and helps to create an environment that reflects and supports our beautifully diverse student population. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Next up, we have Paul Breyer, followed by Kaylee Weber. Welcome, Paul. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. My name is Paul Breer, and I am a member of the Ojibwe tribe. I just finished student teaching in social studies a few weeks ago at Harding High School in St. Paul, and I am one of the teacher candidates who was supported by the Aspiring Teachers of Color Scholarship. I'm very grateful to have received this scholarship. However, I'm very concerned that neither House nor Senate bill include continued funding for this important scholarship program. This scholarship was important to me finishing my licensure program through Metro State, where this past Saturday I was recognized as the outstanding student for the School of Urban Education. The scholarship was important to my success because it provided funds for me to take care of everyday living necessities like rent, groceries, and other bills. It allowed me to focus on my student teaching without having to worry and give 100% to my students and my education. If I hadn't received this scholarship, then I would not have been able to complete my student teaching without having to worry about money and living and other expenses. This would negatively impact not only my grades in school, but also my attention given to providing the best education for the students I taught at Harding. As a product of St. Paul Public Schools, I did not have many teachers that were Indigenous. This is one of the main reasons I chose to go into teaching. I hope to create a change in this education system that often leaves Indigenous students in the shadows. This goal would not be possible without the aid I received from the Aspiring Teachers of Color Scholarship. As you decide on how to allocate monies for these various bills, I ask the committee members to please consider the following. First, support the House investment because unpaid student teaching is the biggest barrier to the profession. reallocate at least $3 million per fiscal year for these scholarships, and shift the House's proposed increased investment of $3 million per fiscal year for the loan repayment program to the aspiring teachers of color. Scholarships, because grant scholarships are more impactful to increase the percentage of BIPOC teachers in Minnesota. With these changes, more teachers of color will not only have the opportunity to follow their passions for teaching, but also make the difference in the lives of our students of color who need positive role models. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Representative O'Neill.
Thank you. I do have just one quick question because this is, it's great for us to have somebody that actually received the scholarship since it's fairly new. And so how much did you receive? You explained the impact, but how much was that?
Mr. Breer.
The amount I received was $7,500.
Oh, okay.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
it really helped out with everything during that time, so, thank you.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So 7,500 one time, and is that for when you were in school for 2 years or for 4 years? How long was it for?
Well, it was for my time in student teaching. And I just finished that up in this past month, so.
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative, and thank you, Paul. Next, we have Kaylee Weber, followed by Danny Ackert. Welcome. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you. Is this good? Okay, now we've had some difficulties. Chair Pulowski, Chair Fateh, members of the Conference Committee. For the record, my name is Kylie Weber. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the State Chair of Students United and a student at Winona State University, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. As students have expressed throughout the session, tuition and cost relief are a primary concern across our campuses. It's time to prioritize students rather than understanding us only as revenue generators. That's why the tuition freeze included in House File 2073 is an essential step towards making higher education affordable and accessible for everyone. The Commitment to Higher Education Act included in Senate File 2075 is similarly critical for ensuring the ongoing affordability of higher education in Minnesota. Of course, we recognize the difficult choices before this conference committee, but taken together, these actions can offer broad tuition relief for all while also creating a transformative program that will uplift more than 40,000 students. We encourage members to craft a final bill that incorporates elements of both proposals. Just as tuition has increased for students across our state, the cost of living and basic needs has similarly increased. Widespread access to menstrual products is one of these basic needs, and we are grateful for Senator Umer Verbaten's leadership towards ending period poverty on our campuses. This language was included in the Senate Omnibus bill, and your inclusion of menstrual equity in the final higher education bill would bring about substantial positive impacts on students' health and overall well-being at a marginal cost. In the interest of time, I'll direct members to the letter Students United submitted that outlines additional measures to address students' basic needs. We appreciate the hard work and dedication of Chair Pulowski, Chair Fateh, and members. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Are there any questions from members? Thank you so much. Next, we have Danny Ackert. Welcome. Followed by Dr. Gavin Bart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, members of the Conference Committee, my name is Danny Ackert. I serve as the Director of State Government Relations for the Minnesota Hospital Association. I'm here in support of the House-only provision establishing a one-time temporary allied health technician scholarship program. I want to point out that this bill was heard in Chair Fateh's committee, and in that hearing, there was language amended on that language actually came from conversations with Representative O'Neill and Representative Wolgamott, who we added an additional element of reporting in the language. So we just want to point that out as this gets discussed, that Senate language is the most up-to-date, and I can and have and will reshare that language with the committee, so that is understood and available. Our support for this provision rests firmly on the fact that there are over 7,000 open allied health technician jobs across the state. This is already impacting day-to-day access and timeliness of care, not just only at hospitals and health systems, but all levels of care across the entire healthcare system. This program is targeted at allied health technicians. We believe that the $5,000 scholarships one time for students entering into allied health technician programs is important because these are critical components of the care team that are required and necessary, and the trend on their availability is going in the wrong direction. So although we support all scholarship provisions that are before this committee, we want to target them in particular because they are required, necessary, and critical to the care team. We also, it was also built after and modeled after the 1000 CNA program, the Certified Nurse Assistant program that is currently underway at the Office of Higher Ed. And this leverages their experience there to make this successful and recruit students or potential students to this program seeking to become an allied health technician. Also want to point out our support for the Hennepin County Medical Center Addiction Medicine Grant Fellowship or Fellowship program in here. And then also the improvements and additional funding for the dual training competency grants. Cannot stress enough how important that program has been for our members and all other sectors of the economy that can participate in that program to grow their own and recruit their own workforce. It's a great program. Really appreciate the support for that. I want to thank the committees, both committees, for your ongoing support and awareness for the critical shortage of healthcare workforce across the state and the recognition that healthcare workforce uniquely relies on a path through higher ed. So all the support that you're putting in this bill for everything will have a very positive impact on the healthcare workforce, and that's something that we really need to do. So thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you so much for your testimony. All right, any questions? Representative O'Neill.
You know I'm going to have questions.
Sorry, I just.
You didn't have time to say, so I'm just going to ask really quickly. Can you tell us the categories again for the Allied Health Scholarship? I believe there were 4, and then with the appropriations that were in the House bill, how many scholarships would that be? And I'll just say a caveat. My daughter is a CAT scan technician, and she's already asked me, when can the scholarships go out? Because I have a person that's ready to go through the program and use the scholarship.
Mr. Ackert.
Mr. Chair, Representative O'Neill, so there's 5 categories that the scholarships will be available for. Medical laboratory technologists, I believe that is the 2-year program. Medical laboratory technicians is the 4-year program. Respiratory therapists, radiology technologists, and surgical technologists. And then each scholarship is one time and is $5,000.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And do you happen to know how many scholarships that would grant in the House provision?
Mr. Ackert.
So I think the funding is set right now that there'd be 1,000 scholarships, or however many are distributed during the period of time where the funding is available for the program.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Gavin Bart, followed by Kelsey Dodson. So welcome, Doctor. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed.
My name is Gavin Bart. I'm an addiction medicine specialist and internal medicine specialist at Hennepin Healthcare, where I direct the Division of Addiction Medicine. And I want to thank Chairman Fateh and Chairman Pulowski for having me here. I am also very thankful to Chairman Pulowski for getting this bill to cross the finish line in the House, and I'm thankful to Senator Fateh for authoring it in the Senate. The "it" is $270,000 per year to support Minnesota's only addiction medicine fellowship training program. Without this support, our program cannot survive. And so my hope is it will make it into the final bill. I would like each of you to think about your own community and your constituents. If someone came to you asking for help for addiction in your community, what medical specialist in addiction medicine comes to mind that you would send them to? If you're lucky enough to live in St. Louis County, it might be Dr. Cole Puringer, one of our recent graduates. If you're lucky enough to live in Mankato, it might be Jeremiah Fairbanks, one of our previous graduates. If you're in tribal territories in northern Minnesota, it might be Chris Matson. If you are in the Twin Cities coming to Hennepin, you might be Dr. Brian Gran, who also has led Minnesota's addiction medicine ECHO training program for generalists, and he's trained general health practitioners in all but one county across Minnesota. We need to secure that we have more of these fellows. So if no physician came to your mind for the question I asked, that sometime in the future, you will be able to identify them. The reality is, across the United States, 90% of medical trainees end up practicing where they train. If we have no training pathway for addiction medicine, it's very unlikely we're going to be able to import the specialists. We need addiction specialists. I was so heartened to hear about all the various programs today and all these loan emergency assistance programs for students. Hopefully some of these students will be inspired to go into addiction. We need a pathway for them to be able to do that, and that would be this Addiction Medicine Fellowship Program. So thank you very much.
Vice Chair Putnam.
Mr. Bart, you mentioned that 90% of physicians in your specialty end up living and practicing where they study. Is that true across all different medical specialties, or is it just addiction specialties?
Dr. Bart.
Mr. Chairman and Senator, yes, it is across all specialties. People end up staying where they do their terminal training. And so if we want addiction specialists in Minnesota, we need to have a pathway for them to train in Minnesota.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from members? Thank you, Doctor. Now, next we have Kelsey Dotson. Welcome. Please introduce yourself and proceed.
Chair Pulowski, Chair Fateh, members of the committee. My name is Kelsey Dotson. I use the pronouns she, her, and I am a board-certified phlebotomist and medical laboratory scientist, and a member of the ASCLS Minnesota. I'm commenting today in support for the Allied Health Technicians Scholarship Fund, which have been giving budget in the House, but neither the Senate or governor's proposals. In 2009, I graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with a degree in genetics and anthropology. If you remember, 2009 was not a great year to graduate from college, and I was expecting my first child. During a financial crisis, it makes it exceptionally difficult to be hired with a general biology degree. And because of this, my husband and I did what many in my generation did. We moved back to his parents' house to save some money while I continued my education at the University of Minnesota's Medical Lab Sciences program. After 4 years at UW-Madison, I was relatively lucky to have mostly low-interest federal loans, both subsidized and unsubsidized, thanks in part to scholarships, Pell Grants, work study, and Stafford loans. All said and done, my debt burden at that time was about $18,500. Because of job prospects were terrible, I decided to defer those loan payments by transferring to the University of Minnesota's MLS program, where in just over 2 years, I accumulated about $22,000 in additional debt because I was considered a Wisconsin resident. In the decades since, I have graduated. Tuition at the University of Minnesota is now $13,520 per year as a resident and $32,000 per year for non-residents. I completely understand why many students are choosing 2-year schools with the ability to transfer to 4-year schools as a way to save money. Cost per credits is just a little bit less. I also understand how programs like the MLS program at the U of M could be passed over by students when choosing their course of study, because students look at starting wages they can expect after graduation. The reality is, had I not graduated in 2009, I more than likely would have found a job in a related biotech industry field and earned more money after graduation. There are many degree programs that require the exact same amount of time that pay better for approximately the same amount of debt accumulated. Targeted scholarships for programs essential to struggling healthcare programs will help attract students to those programs by lowering the upfront costs and student debt. Enrollment challenges will continue as demographics once again begin to shift. And without programs for students to learn, staffing in our hospital systems will always be a concern. This anticipated staffing cliff needs to be looked at from every angle, and targeted scholarships for allied health technicians is one important small piece of a wider industry issue. Thank you for your support and consideration of Allied Health Technician Scholarships Fund. And just to clarify, I would love it if phlebotomists could get added to the list.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Are there any questions for members? Thank you. Next up, we have Paul Serkvanik. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed.
Chair Pulowski, Chair Fateh, and members of the conference committee. My name is Paul Serkvanik, and I serve as president of the Minnesota Private College Council. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I also want to thank you for taking the time this session to listen to our students, meet with them when they came for days at the Capitol, and for giving them the opportunity to testify in your committees. On behalf of our students and the institutions that are members of the Private College Council, I've submitted a letter to the conferees, and our student association leaders have separately submitted their own letter for you to consider. I simply want to highlight a couple of items. We ask you to increase the investment being made in the Minnesota State Grant Program. Increasing the investment in the state grant program will provide larger grant increases for all of the 60,000 low and middle income students who rely on the state grant program to enroll in college and to graduate from college. As noted in our letter, we asked the conference committee to support the governor's position of investing a total of $95 million in new funding for the state grant program over the 24-25 and 26-27 biennia. State grant funding in the House and Senate bill is focused on FAFSA and Pell conformity, and most of that funding will be used to add additional semesters of eligibility for about 6,000 to 12,000 students. For most state grant recipients, the LME increase in this bill is the only way state funding will be used to increase grants generally for students in the first 4 years of college. This LME increase will amount to about $78 for the lowest income full-time students. Given that the recent enrollment declines have been largest for lower income students, this increase is far less than what students need. We encourage the committee to provide larger grant increases for all state grant recipients through a decrease in the student share or a larger increase in the LME allowance, as the governor has proposed. The state serves lower income students and middle income students best when it provides need-based financial aid that accounts for both tuition and living costs and gives students the resources, agency, and self-determination to attend the college that they believe will serve them best. We appreciate the opportunity to testify and ask that you invest financial aid funding that meets the needs of all lower income students, regardless of where they choose to enroll in college. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Senator Verbain.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So our budgets do have the LME allowance increase, and I understand this letter to be talking about a reduction in the assigned student responsibility. I think one of the most troubling things we have seen is while Min State has raised tuition at 23%, the U has raised it by 27%, private colleges have raised their tuition by an average of 40%. So I'm wondering if that decrease is actually going to make college cheaper for students.
Mr. Serkvanik.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, I don't know what you're looking at with the 40% increase, but I suspect it's the published tuition prices at our colleges. And most students, more than 90%, pay a price that's less than that. The average net tuition at our colleges has actually declined by about $900 over the last 10 years. And I would be happy to provide that information to the committee. It declines because as the published price increases, our institutions are making an increased commitment to financial aid for students based on their relative need.
Senator Verbain.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to clarify, that's information that I was able to access from the Office of Higher Education. But I think there's a lot of things in this letter that are troubling. And I don't know that I necessarily need a response, but I don't understand the assertion that Metro State cannot serve students because they're older working students, as though they're not deserving of higher education. I also am troubled by the ask for an increase being coupled with the ask to not do the Minnesota commitment to higher education, which is going to serve students who have a household income below $80,000 and make sure that they can go to a public institution. I mean, those are working class students who deserve to go. And when we look at our attainment goals, I see the state grant as a great program, and I'm glad that we're making the investments in this, but that is students deciding where to go to college. And we're trying to fund a program that is gonna help students actually go to college who cannot afford to do so. I hope that we'll continue to support that as we go through conference. And I understand that you need to advocate for this program that is ultimately vouchers to private institutions, but I think we need to maintain our commitment to public institutions in this committee.
Thank you, Senator Verbain. Senator Putnam.
I was going to kind of raise the same concern that she did, but Senator Verbain did. But I also want to acknowledge that over the past week or so, we've all, members of this committee most likely, have been receiving a very disturbing and unproductive email, spam email, that pits some different elements in this bill against each other and the populations they represent against each other as well. And our purpose here is for the public good. And private colleges play a very essential role in that public good. But there is a very real danger of the perception of selfishness when there is a kind of effort to pit some of these elements against each other. And I found that unfortunate and disappointing. That being said, I have always been and remain deeply committed to the state grant and to the private colleges. As a follow-up of sort to Senator Verbain, when I started teaching at St. John's, it was $23,000 a year in tuition. That was 19 years ago. It's now $66,000 a year in tuition. And I completely understand, being in that context, I know that no one pays the full sticker price. I get you on that one. But there still is a disturbing or challenging, let's go with challenging rather than disturbing, sense that as the price tag on a private college increases, the share of the college grant also, the state grant also increases in a way that disproportionately benefits private colleges versus public schools. And as we said before, the average grant that goes to a student at Anoka Technical College is $900 a year. The average grant in the state system is something like $2,300, $2,400 a year. And the average grant at St. Ben's, where I work, is $5,800. Again, totally support the program, totally support the private colleges, but I do not want to do so in an antagonistic relationship with the public schools. There has to be a win-win-win, is all I'm trying to get at.
Good. Mr. Serkonik.
Mr. Chair and Senator Putnam, the approach we believe is best for the state is a single financial aid program that serves all students with demonstrated need and gives those students the chance to choose which institution serves them best. That's what we're advocating for here today. And then secondly, with respect to the tuition price and the grant, the size of a grant for a student at a private college is determined by the cost of attendance at the University of Minnesota. And whether our cost goes up or not, the grant does not go up except to the extent that a grant goes up for a student at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And the size of grants at our institutions on average are about the same as the size of average grants at the University of Minnesota.
Just one point of clarification. That's
Mr.
the
Putnam.
maximum size of the grant. is articulated to you. Not all of the grants, just the maximum size of the grant. That's correct, right?
Mr. Sarvanek.
It's correct that the cap sets a maximum, and then when you look at the average for students in each sector, they're very close to the same.
Senator Putnam. I appreciate your responses, Senator Putnam, and especially you, Senator Wolverine, talking about the accessibility piece, because the reality is with the Minnesota Commitment of Higher Education Act, it's trying to target our enrollment numbers, and there's an equity piece to that too. We need to attain students, but we need to make sure we're reaching out to students who don't have the option of going to college in the first place. Right now, with this bill, we have a cap at a family AGI of $80,000. And I'm looking at the letters saying that that's still not a good idea, that we should focus more on the state grant piece. But I want to pull up some data from DEED that is probably a few years old, 3 years old, but it shows that the median household income by race for Black and African American families is $36,000. For American Indian families, $35,000. Hispanic Latino, $50,000. So those are a whole lot of families who right now, as we're talking about choice, don't have the choice at all to go to college. And those are the people we're trying to capture right now. So I appreciate your comments, Senator Verbain. Are there any other questions from members? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Jody Gertkin. Welcome.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Fateh and Chair Pulowski and members of the conference committee. My name is Jody Gerken, and I am the Director of State Government and Community Relations for CentraCare. I'm grateful for the opportunity to express our sincere appreciation for the Senate's inclusion of our request for $20 million for an expansion of a medical school in St. Cloud. CentraCare and the University of Minnesota Medical School are partnering to develop a medical school campus in St. Cloud to train medical students to serve rural communities across Minnesota. Unfortunately, rural Americans are at greater risk from heart disease, cancer, unintended injury, chronic respiratory disease, and stroke. Likewise, people living in rural areas face longer wait times for medical care, travel farther to access care, and experience poor health outcomes than their urban counterparts. Compounding this problem is a looming physician shortage that is hitting rural communities the hardest. While 20% of the U.S. population lives in rural communities, only 11% of the physicians practice in such areas. Additionally, rural physicians are older than their urban counterparts. The median age for a rural doctor today is 58, and 1/3 of those are expected to leave the practice in 3 to 5 years. We are confident the best and most sustainable way to address this physician shortage in rural Minnesota is to train new medical students in the communities in which we want them to serve. The last U of M medical school expansion was in Duluth in 1972. Since that time, Minnesota's population has grown by approximately 2 million, yet programs to train physicians have just not kept pace. If no action is taken to solve this problem, the health, wellness, and quality of life for people living in rural Minnesota will continue to be negatively impacted. We urge you to keep the Senate's proposed $20 million in your omnibus bill, as it allows us the opportunity to address this healthcare crisis with a real solution that will impact Minnesotans for generations to come and ensure that access to quality healthcare is not limited by your zip code. Thank you for the chance to express our sincere gratitude and to remedy this crisis.
Are there any questions? Senator Putnam.
Well, thank you, Ms. Gerken, for being here. I want to thank Chair Fateh for including this in the Senate position, and Chair Pulowski for being curious about it. Ms. Gerken, the original formulation of this bill had a much higher budget number.
Much.
Can you talk to us a little bit about your fiscal journey, not your emotional one, from the bigger number to the smaller one? Why are we at where we're at this point?
Ms. Gertkin.
Thank you, Chair Fateh and Vice Chair Putnam. Yes, our original bill was to include all of the things necessary to build out this medical program. And that would include, in addition to the medical school, developing a residency program, providing student and graduate financial support, as well as Rural Focused Research Institute. We have taken off the latter three and are just focusing this $20 million one-time request to help us establish the program and receive accreditation. We are hoping or planning to seek LCME accreditation in December of this year so that we would be accredited in the beginning of 2024 and have our first class begin in 2025. And this would help offset the cost of the $5.5 million that it cost us to put these 20 to 24 students through college, and it would help us build that out so we could cover those costs.
Are there any other questions from members? Thank you so much.
All right, thank you all.
Next on our list, we have Jonathan Bone. Please introduce yourself and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This shouldn't take less than 30 minutes, so just settle in here. My name is Jonathan Bone. I represent the Interfaculty Organization. We have about 3,500 faculty, coaches, and counselors at the 7 state universities. And I just want to start, of course, by saying thank you to all the conferees, all the staff. Especially on the Senate side, you're new to higher ed or new to the Senate, and you really did a great job digging in, learning about the challenges facing our campuses, our students, our communities, and you came up with great solutions. So we're very thankful for that. The bills, of course, are very heavily student-focused, both the House and the Senate. Both chairs did a tremendous job of taking the input of students and putting it into written bill form to solve some of those problems. And it's clear that you have a priority of protecting access, affordability, and quality. So thank you for that. Your O&M numbers, I would just like to say, respect kind of the unique challenges that our institutions face relative to some of the other higher ed institutions in the state. As open access institutions, we need to provide our students with as many support services, as many courses, and all the things that go into success in higher education, and we rely very heavily on your support and state revenue. So we're very thankful for that increase to O&M. One thing that we always say to our students, every dollar that comes from you is a dollar that does not need to come from tuition or does not need to be cut. And so the fully funding the O&M for Min-State is incredibly helpful. I want to piggyback on the last testifier. So St. Cloud State just announced 24 retrenchments, which has laid off tenure faculty. And they also announced a 5-year plan, which will reduce faculty numbers by about 100. And one of the areas that they are cutting is clinical and mental health and marriage and family counseling. And I had a meeting with them last week, and some of the statistics that were brought up in that program, they have about 60 students. 37% are students of color. Currently, there are fewer than 3% of mental health professionals in Minnesota are people of color. And so that program at St. Cloud in particular is a main driver to change that. And so the money that you are appropriating to us and to help face our enrollment challenges will help keep programs like that alive. And then just to go through a laundry list of other things to be thankful for. The tuition freeze. It has been our long-term goal to go back to the 2/3, 1/3 funding model that the legislature had passed into law. The free college program will undoubtedly boost enrollment for low-income students, and we're excited to see how that plays out. The IRAP appropriation is extremely important to our faculty as they try to save for retirement. The one-time money to campuses, I feel like, is unprecedented and is going to go a long way to helping. And the flexibility of that one-time money is also going to be incredibly helpful so that our campuses can address their unique challenges based on what they need to do. Tribal college funding, changes to the state grant voucher program to increase access and distribute equitably through LME is fantastic for our students. The inclusive higher ed funding, the equity initiatives, and more. Be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions from members? Thank you for your testimony.
Oh, come on. Okay.
Finally, we have John Runnigan. welcome, and please proceed with it.
Chair Fateh, Chair Pulowski, and members of the conference committee, my name is John Runnigan. I am the president of Lead Amend, the nonprofit organization that represents Minnesota's 100,000 community and technical college students across the state. And on behalf of our students, I want to thank the chairs, the legislative leaders, and the governor himself for making bold investment in public higher education. For decades, Minnesota's budget has been balanced on the backs of students with budget cuts and subsequent increases in tuition and fees. In fact, tuition has almost tripled in the last 20 years, far outpacing inflation. My journey begins in Fergus Falls, Minnesota. I come from a farming family where we made just enough to not receive SNAP, but not enough to buy groceries. College was never something that I believed was an option for someone like me, because I wasn't a straight A student and I didn't come from a wealthy background. I felt like there was a barrier put in place before I could even make the choice of whether to attend college or not. When I enrolled at M-State, I was told this was the affordable option to go to college. Instead, I had to borrow $6,000 to attend community college. And I'll need to borrow even more as I transfer MSU Moorhead as I continue my degree to become a teacher. While $6,000 may not seem like a lot, this is a huge weight for me. This high cost of college has denied me the ability to move out, to get a vehicle, and even get a loan to help my family out. We need a bold vision that brings students back who are questioning the value of higher education after years of skyrocketing tuition. In fact, free college has increased enrollment by 32% in Tennessee technical colleges and 43% in Rhode Island community colleges. Free college works because the message is simple. Free college will motivate more students to go to college in ways that traditional scholarship programs could only dream of. As a low-income student, the message works with me and so many of my peers who have not entered college. There is robust evidence documenting the impacts of free college programs around the country. This research not only shows the positive impacts on enrollment, equity, and workforce development, but also shows how free college programs can promote FAFSA completion, reduce debt burdens, raise students' K-12 performance outcomes, and more. It is for these reasons that the free college movement has swept the nation, not only as a popular political platform, but because free college programs are backed by decades of rigorous evidence. The free college effort is the best way to address the challenges facing higher education right now. That is why the student leaders at the Minnesota State Universities, the U of M, and the Minnesota's community and technical colleges are united in supporting the free college program that has been offered by the Senate. We are asking you to center your decision-making around the needs of students so that we can build a better future for Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Are there any questions from committee members? That is our last testifier. Representative O'Neill. Okay, good. Thank you all for testifying. I'll now pass the gavel back to the Honorable Chair Pulowski.
Thank you. I better turn this on. I would like the members of the committee and the public to take a look at a single-page spreadsheet. It's dated 4/28/23, 11:23 a.m. It's just 2 pages. The title is Higher Education Finance, House File 2073, Conference Comparison Change Items. So 4/28/2023, 11:23 a.m. It has 2 columns on the far right, AA and BB, and I'm going to have Mr. Savory walk us through those numbers before we go to the motions so that the members and the public understand the fiscal impact of any of the motions. So, Mr. Savory.
Chair and members, Chair Pulowski described the single-page or double-sided document in your packets. The agreed-upon fiscal appropriations are in column AA and BB, AA being the FY 24-25 biennium, and column double B being the 26-27 tails. The House and Senate came in with several identical or similar appropriations. Those columns represent the identical items and items that that are agreed upon. The first one being on line 9. This is the Office of Higher Ed's state grant simplification and federal conformity change requests, including the governor's budget of $17,729,000 and $10,058,000 in the tails. Line 10 is the maintain current service level. That's the operating increase for the department. of $4,214,000. Both bodies had identical amounts. And then $3,184,000 in the tails. Line 11 is the SLEDS appropriation, again, identical amounts between House and Senate. $1,536,000 and the identical amount in the tails. Line 12 is the tribal college grants and operations. This was the $3 million to be distributed to the various tribal colleges of $6 million total in FY 24-25, identical amount in the tails. Skipping down, another identical provision was the Director of Tribal Relations of $277,000 and then $286,000 in the tails. Skipping down to line 17, this is the Direct Admissions Minnesota program. The House and Senate came in with identical $425,000 a year appropriations, but have subsequently agreed to increase that amount to $575,000 in each fiscal year. But that amount is slightly different than what was in the both bills. Line 18 is the Transparent Pathway for Child Development, $475,000 one time. Skipping down several lines, line 23 is the American Minnesota Indian Scholarships, a total of $17 million in both bienniums. Line 24 is the ICAP appropriation of $800,000 only in the first year. Moving down further, there is another one-time, one-year only appropriation in line 27, which is the Higher Ed Public Service Grant Feasibility Study of $75,000. Moving down further, line 36, this is the Fostering Independence Grant Wraparound Service Program. Both House and Senate had this provision, and it was $1 million only in FY 24-25, so there is no tails. Line 40 is the Inclusive Higher Education Program. Again, another identical item between House and Senate of $2 million in each biennium. Moving down further, line 42, the Fostering Independence Higher Education Grants. This is both bodies came in with similar appropriations or similar appropriations above base. The appropriations in columns AA and BB represent the Senate position of $1,141,000 and $1,310,000. And that concludes the Office of Higher Education. So total change items for the Office of Higher Education, $53,397,000 and $42,524,000. Mr. Chair, if you'll flip the sheet over to the other side, there's a couple left for some of the other agencies that was in the committee's jurisdiction. The first one being on line 60, which is the retirement plan contribution increases. This is the House amount, although both House and Senate came in with a change item for this particular purpose, and that is $1,733,000 and $1,777,000. And that concludes the min-state changes. The next one is on line 93, which is the Mayo Family Medicine Residency Program. This was the only change as requested by the governor for Mayo and subsequently carried by both the House and Senate. So it's $896,000 in FY 24-25 and the identical amount in 26-27 for the Family Medicine Residency Program. And then, Mr. Chair and members, line 102 just represents what the target was as listed by the global agreement. And then line 103 is the available resources remaining should the committee adopt the following, the preceding items that I listed off in columns A, and B. So it essentially allow for $593,974,000 of remaining resources, and then $404,803,000 in the tails of the 450 as allocated by the global agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Savory. I would draw everyone's attention then to the agenda. There are going to be a series of motions. If it's a House language, I'll make the motion. If it's a Senate language, Chair Fateh will make the motion. Of course, we'll pause if there's discussion. I'm asking that both House and Senate staff follow along. If there is a question, I'll deflect to one or the other for an explanation. So the first motion would be the chair moves adoption of House language on R2, lines 3.7 and 3.8. Similar language, discussion. Seeing no discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Motion prevails. It is adopted. Chair Fateh, would you move adoption of the Senate language on R2, starting on line 3.9 through R3, lines 3.34?
So moved.
So moved. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Chair would appreciate some ayes from members that help a little bit, just to reinforce that I'm not the only one in the room. Yes, go ahead, turn your mics on for, it's being recorded. You've never been shy before, Representative O'Neill, about using your mic, so if you.
Mr. Chair, you're right about that.
I'm moving down to intervention for college attendance program grants. Chair Fateh, would you move adoption of the Senate language on R3 lines 4.1 through 4.16?
So moved.
So moved. All those in favor signify by saying aye, or I'm sorry. Aye. Any
Aye.
opposed, nay? Motion prevails. Series of grants dealing with foster independence higher education grants. Chair Fateh, would you move adoption of the Senate language on R11 lines 11.23 through 12.14? Chair Fateh
So moved.
moves it. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any
Aye.
opposed, nay. Motion prevails. Chair Fateh, would you move adoption of the Senate language on R15 lines 11.25 through 12.6?
So moved.
Moved. Any discussion, members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion prevails. The chair moves adoption of the House language on R15 on line 15.1. Nonpartisan staff are directed to clarify these two provisions are separate appropriations in Article 1 of House File 2073 and make technical changes as necessary. I've moved it. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion
No.
prevails. Turning to the next page. This is the direct admissions program. The chair moves adoption of the House language on R11, lines 11.4 through 11.6, with a direction to nonpartisan staff to have the appropriation for fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 25 reflect what is in the conference committee spreadsheet. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion prevails. American Indian Scholars, Chair Fateh, would you move the adoption of the Senate language on R12, lines 13.1 through 13.10?
So moved.
Motion has been made. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion prevails. The section dealing with the Child Development Associate Pathway. The chair moves adoption of the A9 amendment to the House language on R12 and R13, subdivision 43, on lines 11.32 through 12.10. So first of all, we need to adopt the amendment. All those in favor of adopting the amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay?
No, Mr. Chair, could you explain what the amendment does?
All right, I'm going to go to Mr. Hopkins.
Mr. Chair, Representative O'Neill, so this moves the Child Development Associate Pathway money from the Office of Higher Education, which was originally supposed to just transfer it to Minnesota State, to a direct appropriation to Minnesota State.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of adopting the amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. The chair moves adoption, the House language on R12 and R13, subdivision 43, as amended. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion prevails. Higher Education Feasibility Study. The chair moves adoption of the House language on R13, lines 12.11 through 12.27. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion prevails. Inclusive Higher Education. The chair moves adoption of the House language on R13, line 12.28. And any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay?
No.
One nay, motion prevails. Chair Fateh, would you move adoption of the Senate language on R13, lines 14.25 through 15.2?
So moved.
So moved. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay?
No.
Motion prevails. Office of Higher Education Agency Administration. Chair Fateh, would you move to adopt the Senate language on R18, line 17.6 through 17.18?
So moved.
I'm sorry, 17.8. Thank you for the correction.
So moved.
It's been moved. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion prevails. The individual retirement plan contributions increase. The chair moves adoption of the House language on R23, lines 20.30 through 21.2. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Motion prevails. The chair moves adoption of the House language on R55 and R56, lines 48.19 through 48.23. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Motion prevails. Mayo Clinic. The chair moves adoption of the House language on R30 and R31, lines 27.13 through 27.30. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Motion prevails. The Director of Tribal Relations. The chair moves adoption of the House language on R11, line 11.3. Any discussion?
Mr. Chair, I do. Just have a quick question. What is the duty of that person?
I'm going to deflect to either Mr. Hopkins or Mr. Savory. Or we can have the Office of Higher Ed if they're still here. Yeah, I know. Welcome to the committee. Please identify yourself for the record.
Hello, committee. My name is Nikki Alver. I'm the Director of Grants and Government Relations for the Minnesota Office of Higher Education.
And I think Representative O'Neill has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering if you could explain the duties of the Director of Tribal Relations, as that's a new role.
Thank you, Chair, Representative O'Neill. So there's currently statute, language and law that agencies should do consultation with tribes. We currently have a tribal liaison, but it's actually one of our financial aid managers, so they don't have the capacity to do the level of consultation with the tribes. So this tribal director will travel the states and do that consultation in addition to additional public engagement related to tribal relations.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then, is this person also have a staff, or is that internally within OHE will staff this person?
Chair, Representative O'Neill, my understanding, this person will not have staff under them. We will probably utilize existing staff if they need assistance with anything, but this person will be the primary person doing the tribal relations work, and that's why we need an individual to that be their kind of sole purpose for the agency.
Representative O'Neill.
And last question, Mr. Chair, thank you. So is this with the additional scholarships that we're doing, Native American scholarships and a few other, the tribal college, the 3 different tribal colleges also getting O&M, is that person also going to be responsible for doing some of that duty as well?
Proceed.
Chair, Representative O'Neill, we make that assumption that that person being the tribal relations director will interact with those various programs and obviously the tribal colleges. We have financial aid managers that will work with the institutions for the financial aid aspect, but obviously having a tribal relations director, we can have a point person when it comes to that type of work.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion prevails. The statewide longitudinal education data system. The chair moves adoption of the House language on R4 lines 5.5 through 5.6. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion prevails. Moving down to Article 2, American Indian Scholars. The chair moves adoption of the House language on R33 and R34, lines 29.9 through 30.14. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion prevails. Going to the next page, the Inclusive Higher Education Technical Assistance Center. The chair moves adoption of the House language on R35, R36, R37, and R38, lines 30.15 through 33.17. Any discussion? Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If we could just get a brief explanation as to what this new office would do, or assistance center would do.
Mr. Savory or Mr. Hopkins?
Mr. Chair, so this is an identical provision in both bills. The Inclusive Higher Education Technical Assistance Center will help assist colleges throughout the state with creating programming for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities to help them receive a post-secondary education.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And can you remind us of the appropriation for that?
I think we just went through it, but
We did. It would be helpful.
here.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Savory.
Mr. Chair and members, on the one-page spreadsheet, it is line number 40. It is $1 million each fiscal year, as well as details. So $2 million each biennium.
Thank you.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all I have.
All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Any opposed, nay.
No.
Motion prevails. The state grant conformity and simplification. These are a series of motions. When I'm done making all of them, then we'll have discussion and a vote. The chair moves R42, Section 4, lines 36.29 through 37.10. The chair moves R42, Section 5, lines 37.11 through 37.15. Chair moves R43, Section 7, lines 38.9 through 38.19. The chair moves R43, Section 8, lines 38.20 through 38.23. The chair moves R48, lines 43.10 through 43.23. Discussion.
Mr. Chair.
Seeing no discussion, I'm sorry, Representative O'Neill.
Sorry, I wasn't loud enough this time. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering if you could confirm that these are, is it federal conformity that we're doing with this, Mr. Chair?
I'm going to, again, deflect to either Mr. Savory or Mr. Hopkins.
Mr. Chair, Representative O'Neill. So yes, these provisions came from the Office of Higher Education with some of the changes to FAFSA, particularly some changes to the terminology. This updates our existing statutes to conform to those federal changes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion prevails. Foster grant conformity. The chair moves adoption of the House language on R43, R44, and R45, Section 9, lines 38.24 through 40.3. Discussion.
Mr. Chair.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you. I'm aware of the foster grant program, but can you explain again just what the conformity part means?
I'm going to again go to Mr. Hopkins.
Yeah, so, Mr. Chair, Representative O'Neill, so you can see the changes on the top of R44. This is sort of an example of that conforming to the federal changes on 38.29 of the House language. So deletes the term student aid index and just refers to the results of the federal need analysis. So it's really mostly a terminological change.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So technical changes. Thank you. Federal conformity. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Just a reminder to everyone, most of these are technical in nature, and there's, the substance of them doesn't vary much between either the House or the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Child care grant conformity added. The chair moves adoption of the House language on R45, sections 10, lines 40.4 through 41.3. Discussion. Representative O'Neill.
Mr. Chair, I don't think you actually took a vote on the.
Oh, I'm
foster
sorry.
grants.
I'm going to have to go back and I'll renew my motion. The previous motion, the adoption of the House language on R43, R44, R45, Section 9, lines 38.24, lines 40.3. Thank you for the reminder, Representative O'Neill. And since we've already had discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion prevails. Going down to the child care grant conformity, the chair moves adoption of the House language on R45, Section 10, lines 40.4 through 41.3. Discussion. No. Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion prevails. The Indian scholarship conformity. The chair moves adoption of the House language on R47, lines 42.10 through 43.9. Discussion. Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion prevails. The dual training competency grants. The chair moves, and these are a series of motions again, and then we'll have discussion. R51, Section 15, lines 43.30 through 44.12. R51 and R52, Section 16, lines 44.13 through 45.4. R52, Section 17, lines 45.5 through 45.9. R54 and R55, Section 24, lines 47.23 through 47.30. Discussion.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I understand that there's some, in my view, kind of significant changes in this, only because I wrote this language with then Chair Bonoff in the Senate. Excuse me, yeah, Chair Senator Bonoff. And I'm just wondering if we could just highlight, I think it was in the application or the, kind of like the prioritization, I believe, has changed. If we could just speak to that just for a moment.
Mr. Hopkins or Mr. Savory? Mr. Hopkins.
Mr. Chair, Representative O'Neill, so the change on R54 to R55, you can see the additional language on R55. That's the addition of transportation and childcare as fields that are eligible under the program. We'll start on R51. Section 15 is the house-only provision, which includes recommended as well as required books and materials, which can be paid for under the program. On R52, at House lines 45.3 to 45.4, this adds to the grant award criteria the employer's demonstrated ability to recruit, train, and retain employees who are of color, American Indians, or people with disabilities. Section 17, this changes the amount that the employer the amount that the employer is required to pay under this program to 25% of the total cost of training. And what has not been moved is Section 18, which changes some of the grant amounts, because I think the appropriation has not been adopted yet.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just processing through that. So the portion where the prioritization for companies that have a priority of hiring people of color and so on, which section was that in again?
Mr. Hopkins, sorry.
Mr. Chair, so that was on R52.
Okay.
And the House side, the left side, it's 45.3 to 45.4. So that's adding to the list of factors that the commissioner considers in determining grant awards.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so in our brief, it's the third line down, or the third bullet point down then?
Mr. Hopkins.
On this.
Yes, that would be, Mr. Chair, that would be the third bullet point, R52, Section 17.
Okay.
Or Section 16.
Representative.
Sorry, it's the second bullet point. It's the second bullet point. So it's the second part of the motion. It's sections, House Section 16 on R51 to R52.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I was confused as to which bullet point it was. It's a little overlap, and so I was trying to parse out the numbers, and it didn't quite match in my head. Mr. Chair, I have concerns with this as someone that is helped write the language and lives in greater Minnesota, as do you, Mr. Chair. It's, you know, I mean, I live in a district that's 97% Caucasian, and it's difficult to hire, not that they don't want to, there just is a lot of populace around us. And so I literally, the companies that helped to push this forward would probably be really low on the priority list, because they just, not that they're not trying, it's just that we don't live in an area that has a diverse population. And so I have concerns with this, that it would hinder the program.
Representative O'Neill, I think today we're going to adopt it as is. We can change these as we proceed, and we already have a fiscal item that has to be changed anyway. So I would prefer to start putting the conference committee report together, and we can change it as we move forward.
Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion prevails. The final motion, Chair Fateh, would you like to move the adoption of the Senate language on R53, lines 51.6 through 51.32?
So moved.
Motion has been made. Discussion. Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay.
No.
Motion prevails. Final motion is adopted, and with that, that would be the last item on the agenda. I want to particularly thank both House and Senate staff for working with us for the last few days to put this together. You realize that this is a sort of unique conference committee with 3 people, and we have difficulty having 2 senators and 2 House members working in any room because suddenly we have a quorum. So we're not trying to leave anybody out, but I want to make sure no one says we've had a meeting when we haven't had a meeting. So if you have questions, let us know, and we'll likely include you. I know Senator Putnam was at one, and Representative Wolgamott had also wanted to come to one, but we had, again, difficulty with numbers. So we'll definitely include you if we can. So, Senator Fateh, you have anything to say at the end of the first one?
No, I also want to thank staff for working long hours making this happen, and we got some work to do, and I look forward to continuing this, Mr. Chair. So, thank you.
Thank you. With that, meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.